The form of digital storytelling we decided to choose was a TED Talk given by a Syrian refugee woman who decided to leave Syria and come to America for a better life during the Syrian refugee crisis.
In the given media, what kind of story is being told?
So this story is about a Syrian refugee woman who leaves Syria and escapes to America. In the beginning, she talks about her life in Syria and how she wanted to always come to America and assimilate into the country. And she talks about her being a housewife and her duties over there, and how she eventually learned English to come to America. So, what do you think her story is trying to accomplish?
I think her story is like inviting, but also informing her listeners on what exactly she went through and like happened during the Syrian refugee crisis. And it's through like it's her own personal story, so it's like her point of view, kind of just like going out there and informing everybody about like what exactly she went through in this experience. Is this a familiar type of story to you?
I'd say that this story is not familiar to most Americans, including me, because we don't know the real experiences of war. I know like soldiers and stuff might experience how people in Syria and other Middle Eastern countries live, but this story of migration and coming to America through a dangerous time might only be known by a few immigrants or groups that have journeyed through treacherous ways to come here. So, relating to that last question, what other stories does this story remind you of?
This story also reminds me of like other Syrian refugee stories that I've learned like in school, but also it's kind of familiar to when I hear stories about like parents doing what they can for their like children and for a better life. So for example, like people from like the southern border coming up to America for a better life, not only for themselves, but like also their children and the rest of their family. How many voices did you see that were present in this text?
So, in this TED Talk, there's two distinct voices, the voices of the speaker and the voices of the audience. The speaker is the Syrian refugee woman who's giving her own perspective on what's happening and what she went through during the crisis. And the audience is sort of reacting to her commentary and her story. In this TED Talk, who do you think speaks the most and who speaks the least?
In this TED Talk, we hear the presenter, Asma. Her voice is the one that speaks the most as she's telling her own personal story about the troubles that she went through during the Syrian refugee crisis. So we hear her the most, and for the least, we do hear the audience's reactions during some like emotional or funny stories that she's saying. So we do hear that, but it is like less than what Asma is saying. What voices did you notice are valued in this story?
I think Asma's voice is the main voice that's valued in this story because she's the one that's mainly presenting her point of view and her perspective on what happened during the Syrian refugee crisis. But I also think the audience's reaction to her story also helps her tell her story better and helps her story become familiar to American people who might not know it as well. Do you think the message of this media text is valuable?
I think the message in this media text is very valuable and informing to all audiences. The Syrian refugee crisis is a part of history, so people deserve and should know about it. Asma, who's kind of like telling us her personal story and relating that to the Syrian refugee crisis as a whole, she's giving us a personal insight rather than just facts that the news gives us. So as Americans, we are like gaining insight on what exactly is happening around the world that we may not know about in like our everyday lives. Are there forms of listening within this TED Talk?
Yeah, so there are three main ways of listening to this text. There's the audience that's mainly listening to her firsthand experience of what is happening during the Syrian refugee crisis. There's her listening to the audience's reaction and it's helping her tell the story. And then there's us listening to her TED Talk through YouTube or whatever platform you're watching it on. So, how do you think we're being positioned as listeners?
So, personally, as a listener, I think we are able to pay attention to not only Asma's voice and like the tone and the way that she presents like her story, but also the pictures that she provides and how it goes like hand in hand. And the audience's reactions are also really important. So, like with those elements, we're able to like take those in and then react like appropriately when listening at home. In your opinion, how do you think listening in an audiovisual or digital context is different than listening to a disembodied voice.
So I think although the digital storytelling provides a good example of what she went through, I think if we actually sat in the audience and listened to her live, I think her story would have had more impact to us because we would have been there in person and listened to her voice, how she really reacts, rather than listening through a camera and looking through other perspectives and seeing how she listens to the audience and the audience listens to her. So who else do you think would listen to this kind of story?
I think that other students who are trying to do research on this specific topic may come across this story and this TED Talk to like gain more insight and educate themselves, but also like just other people in general, other Americans who just want to educate themselves and gain more insight on this topic may like come across this story and take it in and react like emotionally to like one person's experience. Overall, this story gives voice to a person who's not typically heard from or given a platform to speak about. And by listening to this story, we as like audience members are able to learn firsthand about people's experiences during difficult times, specifically the Syrian refugee crisis.